shared with a friend this morning that this morning's scripture reading was going to be proof that we took every single word of God's word very seriously, and glad to enter in to Esau's genealogy. Some of us might be familiar with what's referred to as choose your own adventure stories. I think we've even referred to, between Pastor Alex and I, referred to them in our messages before, where you begin reading a book and you, as the reader, the author gives you the opportunity to choose which direction you want to go in this book at this point. And based on the decision you make, the story unfolds in a unique way according to that decision. And in a sense, that's how the book of Genesis operates. The very outset of the book, sin enters the world. And God promises to upend that sin. It's done its deed on humanity. It's done its deed on the earth itself. And God promises to turn it all around. He does this as He's cursing the serpent. He says that He's going to put enmity between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring, and the woman's offspring will crush the serpent's head, but the serpent will strike or crush her offspring's heel. And so, in that, as a reader, you can understand that very simplistically and say, okay, so this serpent was used by Satan to interfere with God's perfect plan for creation, or God's perfect setup. And as a result of that, snakes are now going to live under this fear of getting stepped on. That's the most simplistic term, and people, as they step on a snake, might get bitten in their heel. Is that the only idea that's happening in Genesis 3? And the answer is no, that there's something much, much, much more deeply significant taking place there in that passage. And what that significance is that who the serpent was inhabited by, namely Satan, the deceiver, the accuser, the evil one, his work is going to be completed, destroyed, annihilated by God through one of Eve's descendants. And so as the book unfolds, you sort of, all the way through the Old Testament to the New Testament, you're wondering, how is this plan going to play out? Who is going to be the descendant that's going to crush the serpent's head? When's it going to happen, and who's going to do it? That's the question. And Genesis begins answering that question. The narrator of Genesis begins answering that question by demonstrating that God Himself has His hand on a specific family line that is uniquely, specially set aside and chosen to bring about the destruction of the evil one. And so as you read through Genesis, you're watching, you're waiting, you're seeing who is this special family line through whom God is inhabiting in a unique way and has His blessing on in a unique way that will put to end Satan and what he's done and what man did in listening to him. And so we watch as God has His hand on this special line. And what we see in this line is what we can anticipate in this coming descendant. What do we see in this line? Well, we see that this line has fellowship with God. They have access to God. They have the protection of God. They have the security of God. They've got the joy of God. They've even got physical, material prosperity of God. And we see God uniquely involved with this people, and we say, is this a glimpse of what's to come? And then as God's chosen one, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, comes through Mary, we find an even greater revelation of what this relationship could look like. We see that Jesus is healing people left and right. We saw some of that in the Old Testament, but Jesus is healing people. He's blessing people. He's bringing a relationship of God to people in an amazing way. And we're beginning to see in the New Testament the full realization of what God saw or promised in Genesis chapter 3. But all along through Genesis, this family line has multiple options. Right from the very get-go, you have Adam and Eve bearing Cain and Abel and Seth. And you see these three boys and you're saying, who is it going through? And Abel's killed. He's killed by Cain. And then you see Seth, and it actually is on Seth. But each time, each character, each descendant is sort of like a finish your own story sort of event. Choose your boy. Choose the one that you're going to follow here. And this is where the narrator does a really helpful it utilizes a very helpful literary mechanism to tell you, to hint which descendant this line is going through, and here's how he does it. As parents have children, the way the narrator does it and demonstrates who God's hand is especially on is he wraps up one story or several stories, several sons' stories, and after he wraps them up, he moves on to the next son who's especially blessed by God, and then you follow his story as far as it goes to the next choice. And so what you find is Cain's story is wrapped up before Seth's story begins. Beyond that, you find Lot's story wrapped up before Abraham's story is carried on. You find Ishmael's story wrapped up before Isaac's story is carried on. And you find Esau's story wrapped up before Jacob's story is carried on. And what's fascinating is that these stories being wrapped up from these brothers, and I forgot to mention Japheth and Ham and Shem, their stories are wrapped up before it's moved on through Shem. And you have all of these things, and what's fascinating is that the stories that are wrapped up are relatively short, and then the story that goes on is very long. For instance, in Esau, it might have felt like an eternity as Pastor read Genesis 36. But imagine if he had read Genesis 37 through Genesis 51. Because that's Jacob's story. Do you see? What's the point of this literary mechanism? The point of this literary mechanism is to tell you this. There are dead ends and there are doorways. Reader, choose the doorway. Follow the doorway. Go through the doorway. Don't go the way of the dead end. Don't do that. Follow God's doorway. That's the idea. That's what's happening here. And what you need to mark is it's not that God's doorway was chosen because of his righteousness. It's not that God looked at Jacob versus Esau and said, you know what, I see more in Jacob than I see in Esau, so I'm going to choose Jacob. No, Jacob was chosen before either of them was even born. Jacob was chosen. Now, having said that, you will see, generally speaking, more righteous flavor in the line that God chose. But that's not why he chose that line. That line is righteous because God chose it. Do you see? The reason you'll see spiritual development in God's people is because they're God's people. Not because they were God's people before he chose them, but because God has uniquely grabbed a hold of them for his purposes. One of the ways that this becomes startlingly clear is when you compare Esau out of the gate with Jacob out of the gate. It's like the gate opens like with horses and Esau's going and Jacob's going. And what's unbelievably fascinating as you read Esau's genealogy and you compare the timelines to Jacob's life and what was going on in his life, you find that out of the gate, Esau was like a lap or two ahead of Jacob. Materially and politically prosperous, way further ahead than Jacob. Just consider a few of the facts. Esau, you might not catch this from what we've been through before. Esau was married roughly 40 years before Jacob got married. Can you imagine that? That Esau was having grandchildren before Jacob may have even been married. I want you just to wrap your head around that Jacob didn't start experiencing even an ounce of prosperity or wives, children, flocks until he was likely in his 80s and 90s. Just imagine that. Esau was far and away ahead of him. And then as Jacob begins to experience a glimmer of prosperity, wives, children, material wealth, he and his family will have to migrate to Egypt to just survive. Meanwhile, Esau's descendants are becoming chiefs and kings, likely at that time, having great recognition. We see something very similar happen with Ishmael and Isaac. When Ishmael's story is wrapped up before Isaac's continues, Ishmael, we're told, has 12 sons. They became 12 rulers of 12 peoples. They lived along a main route between Egypt and Assyria, very likely incredibly wealthy. Esau, in fact, will marry one of Ishmael's daughters, so he would have inherited that wealth. So great prosperity is envisioned for Ishmael very soon in Ishmael's life. Meanwhile, when we take a look back and say, while Ishmael's just exploding with prosperity, what's happening with Isaac, his half-brother? The one that God especially chose and blessed. What's happened with Isaac while Ishmael's experienced this great influx of wealth? Well, we're told that Isaac was 40 years old, and his wife, who he just newly received, Rebekah, was barren. And the reader, if he or she takes the time to sort of work all this out, has to ask himself or herself, I thought that Isaac was the one that God blessed. I thought that Jacob was the one that God blessed. Why is Ishmael, why is Esau just exploding with wealth and prosperity and kids and grandkids? What is going on here? Well, friend, I want you to learn a very significant lesson that God wants to teach you this morning. Why is this happening? Why does God do it that way? Why does His specially chosen children languish, suffer, experience longing, are seemingly delayed for such an extended period of time, while the others are just moving way ahead of them at a warp speed, it seems? The answer, I believe, is that God, through the pain of waiting, through the pain of suffering, God was seeking to develop the inner spiritual natures of Isaac and Jacob. Mark that they would not handle this perfectly, they'd fall left and right, but God systematically was making and developing weight below the waterline. You couldn't see it. But He was giving them ballast. He was giving them such a spiritual weight that you couldn't see right away, so that that weight might be transferred to subsequent generations in a beneficial way. And so they weren't as immediately prosperous as their counterparts. One was growing in prosperity, but one was growing in grace. And God says, I want my kids to grow in grace. I want them to develop a nature that leans on me when they get in trouble instead of grabs their own sword, relying on their own mechanisms. Instead, they look to me. That's the weight I'm seeking to develop in my kids. That's the idea. And so I will place them in painful moments. How does Paul say it in 2 Corinthians 4? This light, momentary affliction. It's light, it's momentary. Jacob and Isaac are saying, 40 years is light? That's momentary? They might have been feeling that during the time, but looking back, they'll understand it as that. It's preparing for us an eternal, contrast that with the momentary, an eternal weight. Contrast that with light, a weight, substance of glory beyond all comparison. As we look to the things, as we look not to the things that are seen, that's what we see in Ishmael and Esau. We see the prosperity, we see the material wealth, we see the huge families. He said, but don't look to that stuff, but look to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. This is what God's doing with Isaac and Jacob. In these long years of waiting, He's developing in them the things that you can't see. Those are the things that are the most valuable. Alexander Solzhenitsyn puts it this way: we always pay dearly for chasing after what is cheap. We always pay dearly for chasing after what is cheap. And so, friend, I'm telling you, don't chase what's cheap. You'll pay dearly for it. And generally speaking, the stuff that's cheap is the stuff that comes quickly, the stuff that you can see, the stuff that you can quickly apprehend. Don't do it. Don't do it. Chase after the stuff that's of greater substance, of greater weight, which generally is unseen. You can't see it. Listen what the author of Proverbs says. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline. This is what I believe the Spirit was ministering to Jacob and Isaac as they might have looked at their brothers and say, God, am I blessed or am I not? Because it looks like they're going gangbusters over there, and I'm like barren, nothing's happened. Do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of His reproof. For the Lord reproves him who He loves, as a father the son in whom He delights. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding, both unseeable. You can't see wisdom, you can't see understanding. For the gain from her is better than the gain from silver, and her profit is better than gold. You can see silver, you can see gold, you can hold it, you can touch it, you can use it in a tangible sort of way. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. You see, this is what God is escorting Isaac and Jacob into, in contradistinction than what Ishmael and Esau were experiencing. Unfortunately, this was not the route that Esau took. Esau, we will find, chased what is cheap, and he would pay dearly for it. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament make a big deal out of Esau settling for a bowl of what he thought was stew and overlooking his birthright, which the birthright included spiritual stature as well as material gain, and Esau just passed it up for a bowl of stew, which the author turns out to tell you that it was just lentils. In other words, it didn't even have meat in it. It was of no substance at all. And he passed it up over something of great substance. He chose the route that was cheap, and he paid dearly for it. We see it in that choice, but that's not the only place we see Esau chasing what is cheap and what comes quick and easy. Consider Esau's choice of women. Genesis 26, 34 and 35, it just gives you the bare details. But if any of us are involved in any situation with in-laws that's painful, just consider this. Genesis 26, narrator writes, when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. And they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So I want you to imagine Esau's choice in women were such that they made his parents' life bitter because of his choice. Later, we'll get more detail on that when Rebekah is wanting a wife for her son Jacob, and she says to Isaac, she says, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? That's how poor of a choice Esau made, and he made it twice. When Esau hears of Rebekah and Isaac's disdain for the Hittite women, he immediately goes and he marries one of Isaac's half-brother's children, Ishmael's daughter. But again, even this it's not a well thought out decision. Isaac and Rebekah wanted Jacob to go to the homeland, not to Ishmael, but Esau is just quickly responding to the first thing he sees or hears. He's just a quick, sensually driven man. But we don't just see it in him passing up his birthright, and we don't just see it in his choice of his 3 wives. We see it additionally in his choice of where to live. He's living in Canaan. He's living in the Promised Land until Jacob moves into the Promised Land, and then he chooses to move out. Interestingly, him moving to where he moves in Seir from Canaan is just take a guess in which direction. Well, for those of you who have been following with us through Genesis, you know that anytime someone moves east, it's like a bad decision. Seir is east. He goes east. And he settles outside of the Promised Land. And it's hard because as a reader, when you read Genesis 36, if you read it isolated from the rest of the book, you'll think that it's a very kind decision that Esau made because the text says their herds were too large to settle in that area, so Esau chooses to move. But does that sound like someone else earlier in the book of Genesis? Well, it sounds a lot like Lot. Lot moved out of the Promised Land for sake of his herds as well. But we find that there was some materialism wrapped up in it. He gets wrapped up in the wrong people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I trust that the narrator is making a comparison between Esau and Lot, making similar choices for potentially similar reasons. So we see that Esau passes up his birthright. We see that Esau makes poor choices for his wives. We see that Esau makes poor choices for his living situation. And at that point, when you add those things up, we're not surprised at the sum of those choices. You might be annoyed as the reader to see all these names piled up in Genesis 36 and say, let's just get past it already. Let's just move on. When's it over? But the names are significant. I'm so grateful to Pastor James Boyce, who systematically went through each of these names in this genealogy, and he tried to understand what the name meant. You see, in our day, we tend to name our kids by names that we just like the sound of it. We don't actually, at least many people don't actually look maybe into what the name means. You might find that out later, but you like just how it sounds. But that's not how it was, generally speaking, in biblical times. Names generally carried significance, even set trajectories for the individual's life. And so names were significant. They were an indication of the heart. And as Pastor Boyce goes through and considers all the meanings of these names, he comes away with one word that summarizes, one description that summarizes all of the names, or most of the names, in Esau's genealogy, and his word is sensuality. Sensuality. Just consider. Adah, wife that he chose, means ornament, or mourning. That's what her parents named her. Elon means where deer are found. Zibeon means hyena. Basemath, perfume. Eliphaz, pure gold. Nahath, rest. Zerah, rising or east. Dishan, gazelle. Alvan, wicked. Shepho, bald. Ai, hawk. Eshban, restorer. Ethron, advantage. Karan, turtle. Akan, swift. Eran, mountain goat. Jobab, jubilation. Basra, fold. Akbor, mouse. You catch in the repetition of these names just a trivialness, a sensuality, just an of-the-moment sort of thing, not much deeper. There are two, however, that could possibly have reference to God and likely do. Ra'ul, friend of God. Jeush, God helps. Interestingly, these two were very early in Esau's timeline. But what you find is that the further on, the further out. 81 personal names and only 2 contain the name of God, Boyce notes. 81 compared to 79. Just consider that for a moment. What you begin to gather is that Esau's centrally driven, not putting the emphasis where it should be, and his genealogy shows for it. Now, I want to be careful. I want to be careful to say that this isn't to say that Esau had no spiritual life. 2 of his children had names with reference to God early on in his life. That's positive. We also see that Esau forgave Jacob. That's positive. That's a shining moment in Esau's history. But even then, it's possible that his forgiveness of Jacob, do you remember what Rebekah said to Jacob when she told him to leave and to go to Haran to get a wife for himself? Do you remember what she said? She said, just go away for how long? Just a few days, until Esau's temper subsides, and then you can return. What this seems to say is that Esau was one that exploded, but then his life moved on, and it wasn't quite as bad as he thought. He got happy again. And I hate to be pessimistic, but there's a part of me that wonders, did Esau receive Jacob so gladly because God had indeed taken care of Esau like he said he would? And so he's blessed, he's got what he wants, he's got his wives, he's got men that fight with him, he's got material wealth, and so he said, hey, birthright's no big deal. Was there an ounce of that forgiveness that was still a passing up of the birthright? And saying, I got everything I really need, who cares about the birthright at this point? I got the material side, why do I need the spiritual significance of it? I hate to be pessimistic, but I wonder if that's what it was. Esau got his due and then he was fine. The point, walking away, is that Esau's choices were largely, if not all, secular. And it showed up in his family line. I want you just to contrast for a moment Esau's family line and the names of his kids and what we'll share later on. And I want you to contrast that with Jonathan Edwards, a 18th century pastor. And this is written in a biography about him. This particular chapter is written by Noel Piper. And I just want you to read what she writes about Jonathan Edwards' children that followed him. She writes, in 1900, A.E. Winship made a study contrasting two families. One had hundreds of descendants who were a drain on society. The other descendants of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards were outstanding for their contributions to society. She writes, by 1900, when Winship made his study, Jonathan and Sarah's marriage had produced, catch this, 13 college presidents, 65 professors, 100 lawyers and a dean of a law school, 30 judges, 66 physicians and a dean of a medical school, 80 holders of public office, including 3 U.S. senators, mayors of 3 large cities, governors of 3 states, a vice president of the U.S., a controller of the U.S. secretary. Members of his family wrote 135 books, edited 18 journals and periodicals. They entered ministry in platoons and sent 100 missionaries overseas, as well as stocking many mission boards with lay trustees. I just want you to see what God can do with one who leans wholly on Him. Beyond this, you find from the genealogy that Esau is equated at 5 different points with Edom. Beyond that, Edom is mentioned 6 additional times, and then Seir, which is an alternative word for Edom, is mentioned 5 times. So Edom is all over chapter 36. That Edom is the result of Esau. And what do we know about Edom? Well, we know that Edom had great animosity towards their cousins, Israel. What do we know about Edom? Well, for those of you who are reading through the Bible in a year program, you just likely read this week that when Israel was leaving Egypt out of the Exodus and they made it beyond the Red Sea and they're trying to get to the Promised Land, they needed to pass through Edom. And so Moses requests, can we have passage? We won't touch anything. We won't do anything. We just want to walk through on this main route. Edom comes back, says, absolutely not. If you step foot in our land, we'll come after you with the military. They said, listen, they're destitute. We just need to make it to the Promised Land. If we drink water, we'll pay you back. Just please give us passage. Absolutely not. Beyond that, we'll learn from the prophet Obadiah that was written to send a curse, in a sense, on Edom, to send judgment on them. That when Judah, who represented Israel at the time in its fullest sense, was attacked by a neighboring civilization, Edom was aware of the attack, and not only did they not help Israel, did they not assist them in this siege, they actually plundered Israel after the siege. They went and took all the goods from Israel. And beyond that, as some Israelites escaped from the siege, the Edomites actually stopped them and caught them and handed them over to the conquering civilization. I remember teaching on this passage with some junior hires at Gitchagumi one summer, and I had one student stand in the back of the auditorium, and I gave him just a huge bag of Starburst candy. And I said, the only thing you have to do to keep it, to walk out of out of the tabernacle with this bag of candy, is walk from the back to the front to me. That's all I want you to do. Just walk to me. And so he gingerly starts walking to me. And you're going to think I'm so cruel after this, but I had my friend Tony Laidlaw, who's this big guy, jump out of the pews halfway of this poor kid's journey up to the front. And he grabs the kid's bag of Starbursts and he rips it as wide as he can. And Starbursts go everywhere. And what do you think all the other students did? They plundered the Starbursts, right? And I hope I had some extra for the poor kid. I can't remember if I did. But that's what Edom did to Israel. They're getting plundered, and instead of helping them, they go and they take everything. Beyond that, they hand them in. But friends, Edom's animosity to Israel doesn't stop there. Have you ever heard of a guy named Herod? Do you know what Herod did when he got wind of God's son being born? We had every child in Bethlehem in that area killed who was 2 and under. Do you know who Herod was a descendant of? Esau. I want you to see that a poor spiritual appetite leads to an awful family legacy. I want you to learn that lesson from Esau. For much of the time of Esau's time on earth and his descendants' time on earth, they had a prized position of land. Their city center was called Petra. Petra was a nearly perfect defense. I'm going to just summarize the defense. That in front of Petra, you had a feet wide valley through tall stone that you had to walk through to even begin getting into Petra's area. It said, I can't remember let me look here real quick. Let me just read a portion to you about Petra. James Boyce writes, how impregnable it all seems. Experts say that because of the configuration of the Seek, this valley that you had to watch through, this narrow valley through which Petra is entered, it would be possible for 12 men to hold it against an army. Again, even if the Seek were breached, it would be possible for the inhabitants to carry a successful defense from the mountains. From a human perspective, it is hard to imagine a safer spot than Edom and its capital city of Petra. It is understandable that the inhabitants would say, as Obadiah reports the Edomites as saying, who can bring me down to the ground? Yet God said that Edom would be brought down. Though you soar like an eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, which he did. So I say this to say that at the outset you see Esau moving so far ahead of Jacob in all the ways that matter from a horizontal perspective. But what God was seeking to develop in Jacob was a vertical perspective. In the bulletins, 2 Chronicles 16:9 says, for the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. And unfortunately, friends, it appears that Esau's heart was not so. I want you to ask yourself this morning, do you sense God working in you to break you of your independence, your pride, your self-reliance, your self-sufficiency, and to show you your weakness so that you lean into him? If you sense that, don't fight it. Go with it. You know, as I thought through Esau's psyche, I had this thought that I encounter every once in a while within the church, within families within the church. You got a lot of large families within the church. And it's difficult, you know. There are people in the church, there are people outside the church that judge people in the church, and they say, you know, and whether it's our church or any church, and say, look, I know the people in there. They're just a bunch of hypocrites. I'm not going to go to church, just filled with hypocrites. And you know, I believe that Esau could have said that of Jacob. Really? That's the guy that God's blessing. You ever watched him? You ever followed him around? You ever see what he does? I know him. I know him better than you. I want nothing to do with that. And then, when Jacob's life maybe starts to take some better turns, instead of Esau bowing the knee to Jacob's God, he feels like he's bowing the knee to Jacob, and so he doesn't want anything still to do with it. He feels like if he follows Jacob's God, then he has to condone everything Jacob's done. But I think I'd say to Esau, you don't. You don't have to condone everything Jacob's done, because God doesn't condone everything Jacob's done. And if you knew Jacob as well as you think you do, you'd see God tearing him up inside for 20 years with a guy just like him named Laban. And so Esau, don't be so quick to say that if you follow Jacob's God, you have to condone all of Jacob's behavior. And I'd say to someone outside the church looking in and saying, you know what? You're right in saying that the people in the church do wrong things, because they do. I might know that better than anybody, in fact, even better than you. But to reject their God because of their ill behavior on occasion is wrong. Following their God doesn't mean that you stamp your okay on what they did to you last week and they went to church Sunday maybe not even thinking about it. What they did wasn't okay, but what you have to do is you have to trust that God will straighten that out in them, just like He'll straighten out your junk in you. You see, when I hear this from people, what I hear is someone who's trying to be God. In our Connect group last week, I had in the sheets for everybody to read Psalm 37. If you haven't read it yet, I strongly encourage you to read it. But one of the people in our group said that as they read Psalm 37, which is essentially God settling everybody's problem with them and working it out and disciplining them, and He's going to handle all justice that needs to be handled. The person said, it was like just a weight lifted off my shoulders. Because friends, we are so prone, and I do this exact same thing. That's what I said. I carry that too. And somebody's wronged me, and I just want vengeance. I want justice. It probably would look a lot like vengeance if I did it. But I want justice. And wanting justice is not a bad thing. Saints in Revelation will long for justice. But what I want you to be cautious about is I want you to be cautious about throwing out someone's God because that person is a sinner. You see, it's just possible. And this is what I would say to someone outside the church saying, man, I can't follow that God because I know this guy and this girl, and I know this, and I know what they do. I've seen what they do. I can't go to that church. I say, you're playing God, and it's not your place to play God. Trust that if they're His, He's handling it. And you just come and you bow the knee, not to them, but you bow the knee to God. And maybe, just maybe, if you bow your knee to God, He might actually give you the opportunity to help that person out of their sin. So bow the knee to God and leave the results to Him. I wish that's what Esau would have done. It's possible that he did it to a degree. But it's also very likely that he didn't do it to the degree that he should. And it showed up in his family line for ages to come. Friends, get things right with God, and He will work out every problem you have with people. Amen? Ask the musicians to come.